Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Within COVID, there are so many businesses that have been affected, negatively affected. Some certainly have been thriving, but there's some industries that have been severely impacted by it. And one of them is hospitality. And we have with us here a guest, Dave Willner, who served as the Chief Operating Officer for Skyport North America, one of the nation's premier airport hospitality groups, for almost 5 years. If you have been on a plane, you have probably experienced their services. If you've been in an airport, you most likely have eaten at one of their restaurants. And so he was doing that while COVID hit, and then a lot of things changed from there. And we're going to talk about that, unpack it. What did he learn from that? And of course, from his many, many years of experience. He is now the newly appointed National Director of Food and Beverage at Sun Communities and Sun RV Resorts. That's part of the pivot through COVID, and we'll talk about that. So I'm just really excited to have him here. Dave, welcome to the Leaders Transformation.
Thanks, Nicole. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's great to have you, and congratulations on your new role and being able to transition. Shout out, before we go any further, a shout out to Norman Wolf. Norman has been on this show, and it was several months ago that I had him as a guest speaking about what he's passionate about. And he's the one who actually introduced me to Dave. And so thank you, Norman, for that. We appreciate you and the support for this podcast. And of course, you, our listeners and viewers out there, we appreciate your support as well and tuning in. If you like this episode, if this has inspired you, encouraged you, maybe you know someone who is going through a difficult season in their business, please share it with them, and so that it can encourage them as well. All right, Dave, let's talk about this. I kind of alluded to it, but there's a lot of things that have changed in your life and role over the last few months. So let's, first of all, just bring us up to speed. How did you become, I know I read reading your bio, you were an actor. You call yourself a starving actor in New York City. And that was many, many years ago, but now then becoming the COO of Skyport North America. Tell us a little bit about that journey, kind of to bring us up to speed to today.
Sure. Yeah. So I started my career, as you said, as an actor. The starving thing just came as an added bonus. I was certainly not setting out to be a starving actor. So I was living in New York and living that sort of cliched life of having to wait tables to survive because you got to pay the rent. And I was fortunate enough to find a job waiting tables with a man named Danny Meyer. And for those of you that don't know, Danny Meyer is probably one of the most iconic restaurateurs in New York, and possibly even the United States or the world. He's gone on to tremendous fame and success through Shake Shack, but in the days before Shake Shack, which is when this was, he was really known for what's called Enlightened Hospitality, which was this idea that if you put your employees first as the most important aspect of your organization, everything else will then fall in line. So putting them ahead of your customers even. I fell into this organization and fell in love with this concept. And so guzzled the Kool-Aid that was Danny Meyer and Enlightened Hospitality and became this sponge for all that the industry had to offer. I eventually met a girl and priorities changed a little bit, and I didn't really like being a starving actor as much as I once did. It wasn't as romantic as, eating with this young lady. And so I sort of had this crisis at the time of what do I do and how do I do it? And my boss with Danny's organization said, hey, you should think about being a restaurant manager. You're really good at this. Why don't you try it? And so I decided, you know what, let me put acting aside for a year. Let me dive headfirst into the world of restaurant management and see if I like it and if it likes me and if I'm any good at it. And if not, a year from now, I'll go back to, the glamorous life of off Broadway. And to my surprise and delight, I loved it. I was quite good at it. And I really felt inspired and inspiring to lead these missions of an employee first culture. And so that's really my foundational training, is with that Danny Meyer spirit, that I was able to then take and launch into a lot of different directions from there. Once I wound up really devoting my professional life to hospitality, It took me in some fascinating places, from small entrepreneurial-minded restaurants in New York to large corporate giants, and multi-million dollar organizations. But I think throughout it all, it was always using that baseline of how do we put the employee first? How do we take care of the people that are taking care of us so that we can ultimately build a successful organization from there? So that's why I think the secret to my success really is always having that as the foundation for every choice that I've made and every strategy that I set. And that sort of was the building block to continue my career through, from manager to general manager to director of operations to regional director all the way up to the C-suite. So I owe it all to Danny in one way, shape, or form, for sure.
That's amazing. And I love that term, enlightened hospitality, because, hospitality ought to be enlightened, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of being able to serve and serve well and have people have a great experience. But it's what's interesting is that, yeah, you can focus on the customer experience, but what you're talking about is first the employee experience, so that the customer experience is actually served as well. So both are served. It's that rather than the either or, it's the and conversation. So I love that. Now, before we dive into some of the things that you've learned and some of the principles of putting your employees first and what that looks like, let's talk about when COVID hit. So you're the COO of Skyport North America. You've got 70 restaurants, 1,300 employees, and COVID hits. The airports, no, people aren't flying, people aren't going to restaurants, all of this is going on. What was it like to have to deal with that? Because I know you said that you went from 70 restaurants to one, and 1,300 employees to 50. And that's a pretty significant impact.
Yeah.
What was that like? How did you navigate through that? How did you make those hard decisions?
In a word, it was devastating. We had spent the past 5 years really building up this organization and recreating this organization in many ways, adding to the footprint, to the reputation, to the top line, to the bottom line. We had reinvented this organization, I think, in a way that we were all extremely proud of, both with our business partners, with our airport landlords, and most importantly, with our staff and with our team. And so when COVID hit, this 5-year slow build of going from, when I first started with Skyport, I think we had 25 places and one airport. And then 5 years later, we had 75 different contracts across 5 airports. That was a nice, slow, build. And then all of a sudden COVID hits. And the day before COVID hits, you think your arrow is pointing firmly up. Everything was going so well for the organization in terms of business development and new opportunities, both with existing partners and new partners, in the pipeline. And then COVID hit, and like that, it all had to be dismantled. And as you mentioned, we had these 75 different locations across 5 airports. Just because of pure safety reasons, we had to bring that down to 1. So we started closing locations, partly because of necessity, because there was nobody traveling, partly because of necessity and safety, because we couldn't put our staff in that position, and partly for survival, to try and hang on for dear life. And so to break this thing down from what was such a meteoric and prideful build was devastating. I think to go to the other part of your question about how do you do that and what is it like, it goes back to what we were talking about before, being true to the employees first and foremost. And so it was important to me, and it was important to us that we were highly communicative, that we took care of our employees even in their departure and eventual termination. I think that we watched a lot of organizations in and out of the hospitality world have to go through something similar, right? Where they, COVID hit and all of a sudden the scope of their world just changed so dramatically. But I think those that handled it well are the ones that took care of their employees, whether that's with um, resources and monetary funds, or with communication, or with transparency, or with integrity, or ideally with all of the above. And so it was important to us that even on our way out, we still could hold our head high and say, we are the organization that we've always said we are to you. And we're going to continue to honor and support you and love you and cherish you, even though you're not going to be working for us anymore. We're going to arm you with as much information as we possibly can with what might happen to you next, what might happen to us next, how we can stay in touch in the future, because especially back in March, this was a big question mark. And here we are all these months later. I don't know how many of those questions have been answered quite yet, but certainly back 6, 7, 8 months ago, it was even more scary and confusing for all. So I think it was important to try and translate as much as that as possible for your team, so you could really hold your head high.
Well, you mentioned communication. I think that people realize that stuff happens and the reality of the impact on a business as well. But when you don't communicate, then you leave them out of that loop. And so I think that's a really great point, an important point, because oftentimes that's the thing that falls down. It's like the leadership doesn't know what to say, so they don't say anything, or they try to avoid it. How are you doing? Fine, fine. And all of a sudden you realize it's definitely not fine. And so, but it's already too late. The damage has already been done. And so that's a really important piece.
And just to pivot
Mm-hmm.
on that real quick, I think in fairness to leaders, there is a tendency, whether you're a leader or a parent or a teacher, I think there's a tendency to say, people look to me to have the answers. And if I don't have those answers, I'm going to, retreat to over here until I can find those answers for you. And that's not necessarily wrong. I think that's almost human instinct. But in a situation like this, and I would argue in probably almost every situation, you should never be afraid to not have the answers. And I think owning that, as we had to, back in March, instead of going like this, you're going like this. And you're saying, look, I know you're looking to me to have these answers, and I know you're looking for this roadmap. I ain't got it, and I think that almost gives them more peace of mind that there's, again, honesty and transparency and active communication, even to say, I don't know, as opposed to this abyss of question marks that sort of feel like you're throwing questions up against the wall and they all just keep bouncing off of, nothing. So I understand why leaders don't communicate. I don't think it's with malicious intent. I actually think it's with positive intent, because they don't want to communicate the wrong answer or no answer. But I think that winds up doing more of a disservice, especially in a major crisis like this.
Absolutely. And well said. And we're on the same page, because that's kind of where I was going to go with that is, yes, it's the power of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Brene Brown has become famous talking about that particular topic, but how does that look when you're a leader, when people are looking to you for answers and when you don't have them? And so that's really, really powerful. How in that process so communication, very important through that situation, any situation that's like this. What other leadership skills are needed in order to navigate and keep your own head about you in the midst of, like you said, and I can totally relate to that when you were sharing about the devastation that you felt and being on a high and having vertical growth and then having it all fall apart. I can totally relate to that. That's what actually happened to our family business many years ago. And it's just like, what just happened? And you have to process through that.
Yeah.
So what are some of those leadership skills, communications one, but other ones that are needed?
I think in the customer service business, there's a lot of lessons that you can learn and then expand towards leadership in general. And one of the ones that I always think too is that to be a great sort of customer service advocate, you need to read the neon sign that everybody is wearing. Every single customer that comes into your place has some sort of sign on their chest. And sometimes these signs are bright, flashing lights that say, I'm a pain in the butt, or make me feel important, or I'm high maintenance. Those signs come across really, really clear. And sometimes those signs say, I had a bad day, or, I'm sad, or I want to be left alone. Um, and those signs sometimes are a little bit harder to read, but I think in the customer service business, if you truly want to create hospitality, you have to be able to read those signs and respond accordingly. I always take it a step further and say, okay, the customers aren't the only people that have those signs. The employees have those too. And so as an accurate leader and as a cherished leader, and I think a valued leader, you need to be able to read the employees' signs and respond accordingly. When everything's going well with your organization, when there's no global pandemic, those signs are still present. Those signs can say, I don't agree with these policies, or I'm confused by these decisions, or I think our management is great, or I think our management is unfair. You have to read those signs because they're not going to be read for you. I think in this particular case, what's so interesting about this time and place of the world, I think for the first time ever that I can remember, customers and employees have the exact same sign on their chest. And it says, make me feel safe. And so if an organization can just look at that and say, that's the mission, make me feel safe. I don't need to have the answers about what's going to happen next week or next month, or what the government is doing or isn't doing, or what business might look like. None of it matters. The only thing that matters is make me feel safe. How do I go about doing that today with what's happening today? And maybe how do I do it tomorrow? But you've got to sort of live so much more in that moment to allow yourself the moment by moment by moment forward progress that I think will ultimately allow all these other variables of, the CARES Act or PPP or whatever might come. All of that is just additional information that's going to come. But the major focus should be reading those signs and responding accordingly.
So what I hear in there is first acknowledge, right? You've got to acknowledge what the sign says. And then you said, now that you recognize that the sign says, make me feel safe. How do you do that? Once you've acknowledged it and let them know that you understand how they're feeling, or that you're interested and you want to listen to how they're feeling, how do you make somebody feel safe when, like in this case with Skyport, you actually had to let them go, which creates more uncertainty for them in the sense that, okay, now they've got to go find a job in the midst of a pandemic. I think that's that kind of the extreme, right? So if we can learn how to do it there, then in good times, we'll also have a better sense of how to do it there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think, there's not easy answers, but there's at least an easy finish line, right? Where you're saying, oh, make me feel safe. That's the goal in this particular instance. So how do I do that for those that are keeping their job and are coming every single day, or the customers that are traveling, few and far between as they may be? How do I make those people feel safe within these four walls? And whether that's in, again, communication or additional resources or signage or equipment, whatever that might be, you've got to sort of recognize in this outward, facing approach, this is how I'm going to make you feel safe. Now, if you have lost your job, as we were saying earlier, it's still about keeping them in the tent and sort of saying, this stinks and I get it. Here's all the things that are available to you. Here's the things that are available to you from my organization. Here's the things that are available to you from other organizations or the government or temp agencies or whatever. Let me give you as much information as I can on your way out so that you don't feel like you are walking off a cliff into the unknown. It is scary and it is difficult. I didn't say make me feel less afraid, right? I can't. It's a scary time for everybody, right? But if I can make you feel safe as you go through this scary time, or even just a little safer, I think then it's a win for the organization. And more importantly, it's a win for those individuals. I hope that this doesn't happen a lot. I hope that this is an extreme example, but I think that those themes of trying to read those signs, even in the best of times, I think that's what really differentiates good leaders from bad.
Yeah, and hopefully we don't have any more pandemics coming anytime soon. Let's
That'd be
get
good.
past this one and let's move on. That said, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions that occur that create uncertainty within organizations, market shifts. So whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an election, whether it's whatever, there is going to be shifts that happens. That's the only constant, right, is change. And so I love your response there in terms of how do you make them safe in the midst of that, and that it's not being less afraid, but at least giving them some tools so that they don't feel jilted. They don't feel like you just said, sorry, too bad for you, and let them, figure it out on their own, but you supported them and they knew that, and they felt supported. And a lot of times it is just simply a feeling. That's where it starts. It's like that feeling of feeling support so that they can be equipped to go out and do what they need to do and deal with the uncertainty that is ahead of them. So that's really good. I want to shift gears here and talk about self-care as a leader, because in the midst of this, I have a feeling that you probably had a lot on your mind, and dealing with the fact that you're going to be laying off 1,250 people. You have a family, your career, you obviously now, because I alluded to the fact that you now work for a different company, you left the company as well. And so how did you exercise self-care in the midst of that for you as a leader?
When we went through the layoffs, and it went from, some people were going to be drastically, being asked to reduce their salaries or their rates pretty dramatically. Some people were getting laid off. Some people were getting furloughed. That couple of days, and it really felt like a year, but it was a couple of days, was some of the hardest that I've ever experienced in my entire life, personally or professionally, because you were staring at somebody's face as their world came apart. And you've developed real relationships with these people. And even if you haven't, they've been giving their blood, sweat, and tears for you and for your organization for however long they've been doing that. And it's tragic. And then to add on top of that, the complete fear and uncertainty that I think we as a society had, back in March, because we didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And I remember calling my wife after the first couple of these, and I called her and I said, I'm hugging these people and I'm shaking their hands. And I know we're not supposed to do that, but I cannot tell these people that unfortunately we've come to the end of the road together and then just sort of wave. That's just not who I am, and it's not who I ever want to be. And so I think first and foremost from a self-care standpoint was to remember that we are all humans first. And, there was no winner in any of this. I think sometimes with layoffs, you look at the corporation as the big bad wolf, trying to cut a few bucks or, two. This wasn't that, right? And I think there was an understanding that we were all just trying to survive in our own right. And so in some ways that made it easier, in some ways that made it harder. But I think to always remember that this was another human being that was there. It was important to me that I delivered the news to almost every single person that unfortunately had to go, whether I'd met them before or not. I didn't want them to have this delivered to them by somebody else, because it was that important. So whether it was on the phone or in person, I delivered the vast majority of this news to everybody so that they could hear it directly from me and see how how my heart was breaking as well. I thought that was important. For myself, once I eventually lost my job, as Skyport remained in survival mode, and it just didn't make sense for me to continue in that department anymore, in that organization anymore. Um, it was hard. I also have a family. I have a 7.5-year-old daughter. And this big question mark, particularly because I'm in the food and beverage industry, and the food and beverage industry is decimated. And so, not only was I in the food and beverage industry, I was also, sort of in the travel industry, and those two industries were just completely destroyed. So it was like I had this double whammy. What was important to me was a routine, was not letting the moment be bigger than the movement of what I was trying to do for myself and for my family. There were certainly days where it felt helpless. There were certainly days where it was like, what's the point? Why should I even get out of bed? But that's when you sort of slap yourself in the face and you say, no, I got to get out of bed. I have to. And having that routine, whether it was when I was looking for a job or when I was not looking for a job, what I was doing when I wasn't looking for a job, with exercise and, time with friends or family, even just over the phone. All of that was really important for me to have that routine so that I didn't let the moment overtake me and feel sorry for myself. It does help in the middle of a global pandemic to keep things in perspective. There are a lot of people that are suffering much, much, much more than I was suffering with sickness and death and real despair. So having that helped me keep it in perspective and not feel sorry for myself. But there were certainly some days where it felt like I was staring at a long, difficult road ahead. So I'm very, very grateful and excited to be on the other side of that. But I do think having that routine for myself was probably the most important.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this conversation, and I didn't fully know what was going to unfold in this conversation, but I think there's a relatability, Dave, that you bring for our listeners that are on the side of maybe they're the employee, maybe they're the business owner, maybe they're the one let go. And so you kind of cover the whole experience here, and it's a tremendous experience. So you might want to write a book on it. But anyway.
Well, what's funny, when you asked earlier about how I sort of went from, actor to COO, one of the things that I often tell people is that I've always kept the vision of, who do I wish that I had when I was in the level right below it. So when I first became that floor manager, I didn't have this dream of being a floor manager. I didn't have this agenda of what I was going to do as a floor manager. I just wanted to be the floor manager that I always wished that I had when I was a server. And I've tried to keep that in every step of the way. When I was the director of operations, what type of DO did I wish I had when I was the general manager? And all the way up to the C-suite, and saying, okay, what type of COO do I wish I had when I was, regional director or whatever? And so I appreciate you saying that. I don't know that it's an active choice to be approachable and relatable, but I think it's an important part of leadership and certainly one of the major secrets to my success.
Yes, absolutely. I can tell. So you've got a new role.
Hey.
What's ahead for you?
Well, it's ironic and exciting, but I went from air travel to RV travel. I've joined Sun Communities and Sun RV Resorts, which is one of the largest RV resort communities across North America. They have 450 sites between the U.S. and Canada. They've been growing rapidly over the years, very, very successful business. And then obviously when COVID hit, it just exploded in a way that I think nobody could have predicted. And so all of these sites, or a good portion of these sites, have food and beverage and retail offerings, but the organization hasn't focused that much on those offerings because they primarily make their money through booking fees and through building guest relationships from the resort, not the amenities. And so once COVID hit, and partly because of some new strategy that I think was being thought of before COVID, and then when COVID hit, it really magnified what an opportunity they are missing by not saying, hey, our differentiator for you as a guest isn't just we've got this great property that you can bring your RV to and have a little vacation here in these great locations around the world. Our differentiator is what we offer while you're there. The food, the beverage, the service, the hospitality. And if you can build upon that, not only will you grow your revenues, top and bottom line, but you'll really grow your guest experiences and start to build repeat guests time after time after time, because again, it goes back to what we were saying. They feel safe, they feel valued, they feel appreciated, they feel excited. Whatever their sign says they need, you can now sort of approach in a bunch of different ways. And so they created a brand new role called National Director of Food and Beverage to oversee all of the food and beverage operations throughout their portfolio and to really grow and build who we can be today and who we should be tomorrow. So it's really exciting. It's an exciting company and it's an exciting future. Obviously, RV travel is a huge part of people's vacation plans, both in the present and probably long term. And so to be at the forefront of that right now with such an exciting organization, I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, in this conversation that we had, our pre-chat was several months ago, and what a perfect time for us to do it right now so that we can see the whole scope of it, because now you're in this new role, because what you did was you pivoted, right? And their business is pivoting and you pivoted to say, okay, how can I use and I think this is a really important skill for leaders, but for anyone, right? To be able to adapt, be able to know when to pivot, how to translate your skills into a different industry. So maybe it's not flight in the airline business, but it's the RV business. And I can use these skills that I have in a different arena and continue to move forward, as opposed to getting stuck in, this is all that I know. And so there's a great lesson in there as well. And I'm really excited. And yeah, I imagine there's a lot more people. Of course, with RVs, you can be with your family, traveling down the road. You don't have to worry about all the, interaction and so forth. You can be distant if you want to be, and have that safety if you're, when you're people are concerned about that. And so there's a lot of opportunity, and so it's great. So I'm excited for you.
Yeah, and I think, what's so exciting about the opportunity and about this particular niche is it's the great equalizer, right? And so hospitality should be present for all people at all times. And oftentimes it's not, right? Not everybody is going to the nicest steakhouse. Not everybody's going to the cheapest pizza restaurant. But it should provide the same feeling regardless of which one of those you're doing and regardless of which segment of the population, let's say, is trying to get that hospitality. In this role, I think you need to be available and approachable and accessible for young, old, black, white, rich, poor. You are now providing services, whether it's a cup of coffee or a steak and a glass of wine, for people from all over the country with all different perspectives and all different desires. And you need to sort of, again, read their signs and respond accordingly. So I'm so looking forward to really diving into that and making sure that we are all of those things to all of those people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're going to get a very wide range of people that are going to be staying in these RV resorts. So yeah, really, really great point. And something else that came up while you were saying that is you talked about the steak dinner, the cheap pizza. I think sometimes with the inexpensive meals that people in the hospitality industry feel, and servers from the front lines feel like the service isn't necessary there because you're not paying enough money for it, type of thing. But if you want to be successful, to your point, what you were just saying is, if you want to be successful, even in that, and even if it is volume, then service, customer service is still absolutely essential. Europeans know this. You know, the North Americans, sometimes we let these things fall, but when you go to Europe or other places in the world where they understand the importance of customer service, and what we were talking about earlier, that begins with the employee experience, the employees, the staff, your team. I know some people don't even like the term employee because they like to call them team members or different names that they have for them, is that those are the ones that actually serve the customers. And so you need to take care of them so that they can take care of the customers well and represent your brand well. So yeah, it's really good. Dave, final thoughts for our listeners who are, they're leaders, maybe they could be anywhere on the scale because we just talked about a whole lot, but you know, that you would, recommendations from your experience, maybe what you learned through this process for being able to navigate through uncertain times.
Well, you have to find a way to look at the glass as half full. Absolutely. Looking at it as half empty, even if there's every reason in the world to do so, is a waste of your time and your energy. And I think you need to allow yourself some time to get there and give yourself some time to grieve and to mourn and, you know, to deal with the loss of, you know, your career, or not your career, your role. Give yourself that time to grieve, but then pick yourself up and look forward. And I think, you know, as you said about pivoting, and I think pivoting is the word of 2020. You have to be available. And I think one of the consistent themes that you and I have talked about today is, you know, sort of having this shut down approach or having this opened up approach. And, you know, if you're stuck with tunnel vision about this is what I do, or this is who I am, or this is what I can bring, you're probably limiting yourself. You're probably not looking at the entire picture. And so I think you need to be available to say, no, this might be where I start, but this is where I can really add value to any organization. So for my particular search, everything I've done is in the food and beverage world, and I'm very, very grateful and thankful that I'm still able to remain within the food and beverage world. But I was very open and available to saying, wait a minute, it's not that I'm in food and beverage, it's that I'm a customer experience expert, or it's that I'm an employee culture expert. And that opens things up in a much different and broader lens and gives you a lot more rocks to look under. So, you know, I think giving yourself that focus, to not have tunnel vision and to not limit yourself will absolutely wind up encouraging additional conversations. The more conversations you have, the more comfortable you'll feel with this new state that you're in. And eventually you'll find exactly what you're looking for. I'm sure of it. Does it happen for me?
Brilliant. Dave, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure and enlightening and encouraging, just like I hoped it would be. And for our listeners, I would encourage you, Dave doesn't have a website. Doesn't have all that set up, but what he does have is he's got a LinkedIn profile, and you can follow him on LinkedIn. We'll make sure that is in the show notes. You can go to leadersoftransformation.com and find that information, connect with Dave, follow him. If you are someone that is a business owner and or a leader in an organization and you're looking to improve your employee culture, your customer experience, then I know he's got some great information that he can share along the way and even along his journey going forward, that he can share that with you. And so I would highly recommend, and I suspect you're going to have some recruiters that are going to be earmarking Dave for, you know, for the future as well, because clearly you're a great leader and a respected leader and could bring great value to the organization, which I trust you're going to do with Sun RV Resorts.
Thank you.
So yeah, awesome. And thank you to our listeners for being here. We appreciate you. This is why we do the podcast, so we can share this information with you. Dave and I could have a great conversation offline, but what good would that do to you? And so we record it. We spend the time to do that so that you can benefit from that. And I would encourage, like I said earlier, if there's someone that is going through a difficult season, especially through this COVID, but even just in general, that needs a little bit of encouragement, share this with them. And if you enjoyed it, if you found it valuable, please leave us a rating or review. It helps us to get a greater reach around the world. We're in over 140 countries where we have listeners, and we just want to continue to expand that message out, giving people hope and encouragement that they can be the leader of transformation in their neck of the woods and their world, and where they make a difference. So we encourage you to that. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.